regale you all a tale about my father, Rabbi Dr. Schochet. I can tell you about the time that my grandfather gave a fire and brimstone speech in Shul one Shabbos. I believe it was against the English Empire, who at that time recently hung some Israeli freedom fighters. And when my grandparents went for the usual Shabbos walk, they returned to find a large crowd gathered around their balcony, only to see my father, a young boy of 3 or 4 years old, standing on the porch and repeating the speech with the same vim and vigor as it had been given in earlier that day. A clear precursor to the world-renowned speaker that he would one day become. I can tell you about a young first grader in public school. Back then, everyone went to public school and you only went to Cheder in the afternoon, who witnessed the bully, several years his senior, knock the yarmulke off another Jewish kid. And it so incensed him that he launched himself at this older boy, first to the surprise, and then to the cheers of all the boys standing around, as he proceeded to teach that young anti-Semite a lesson. I can tell you about a man whom every time in davening that he said the pasuk, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, concentrated with such kavanah that a physical shiver would run up and down his spine. I remember once as a young boy davening in the Terev Avodah Shul that the shiver that particular time was extraordinarily large, and a wow of wonderment escaped my lips, at which point my father burst into a huge smile, which really personifies my father, because as deeply frum, Jewish and spiritual man as he was, he never took himself too seriously. I could go on and on. But the truth is, I don't think my father would appreciate that. I say that because in 2011, there was a dinner honoring my parents, my father, and my mother's Langiyarim, for their over 50 years of devotion and dedication to the Jewish community in Toronto. At that time, I was assigned to one task. My father had already gone through radiation, and was still going through chemo, and my mother told me not to leave my father's side with a little bottle of Purell at all times, because of all the hands that he would be shaking. It was a magical evening, and the love of the room was palatable. However, being at my father's side the whole night, I got to witness firsthand that as much as he thoroughly enjoyed the evening, he grew distinctly uncomfortable during those moments when accolade upon accolade were being heaped upon him. And the reason is rather simple. My father was always about the Schochet, the therefore. Everything has to have a tiyela, has to have a purpose. If there are going to be stories said about him, it better have a Musar Haskell, a good lesson that everyone can learn something else from. And therefore, the story I want to share with you tonight has such a lesson. Not very many children grow up in a home where Moonies, Jews for Jay, Harry Tishka, we used to call them, are part of the everyday vernacular. In fact, one of my earliest childhood memories are of Eitan Schwarzbaum, Olav Shalom, and Yehuda L'chaim Tevim, his brother Aaron, whose job it was to grab these brainwashed children with the permission of their parents, and my father would then deprogram them. And one time there was a kid who was too far gone and too old and had gone to the police 19 years old. I was home bein hazmanim in camp in yeshiva. My parents were out at a wedding when the phone rings. I answer the phone, and it's Rabbi Dr. on the other line. He asked my father, I explained that he's out, and he said it's very important that my father call him as soon as he gets back, because they have a yeshiva student who was caught by missionaries. They had him detained in a hotel room, and they were working on him. The problem was that this was no ordinary yeshiva student. He came from a large, illustrious family. His father was a respected Rosh Hashanah, and he himself was learning in one of the elite yeshivas in New York. And because he knew very well how to learn, everything they were kind of coming at him with, he kind of had an answer for it. And they needed someone of my father's caliber to work on it. I assured Rabbi Hef that as soon as my father would come home, I'd pass along the message. And sure enough, when my father got home, phone calls were made, arrangements were put into place, and the boy and his parents were coming the next afternoon. I remember when they came to the house, it was like a scene right out of Me'ashar. Big beard, full Yerushalmi garb, completely out of their element. The boy was ushered to my father's office in the basement, and my mother sat in the kitchen with the parents, speaking to them in her Dutch Yiddish combo, attempting to put their mind at ease. Now in my house, my bedroom is right on top of my father's office. And so long as the air conditioning or heater is not blowing, you can hear every word through the vent. Needless to say, I excused myself, and I spent much of the afternoon huddled up under my desk. The session continued throughout the afternoon and late into the evening, until I decided to take a break and continue the next day. My job at the time was to be this boy's roommate, to make sure that he didn't escape in the middle of the night. And I remember being amazed that here's this boy in this situation. Nevertheless, he's saying Krishna Lavita, they go out to next to his bed, he went to sleep with the Yamka sisters, the whole 9 yards. The next morning after Shacharit, the session continued. Sometimes raised voices and yelling, sometimes talking softly, as is the process of these program sessions. And finally, in the afternoon, there was a breakthrough. They knew there was a breakthrough because the boy broke down and he reached into his shoe and pulled out his birth certificate. The only article of clothing, the only document, that he would need to escape and travel with at that time. He admitted that there was someone from the church that had been following them, even on the plane, following their every move to Toronto. I remember my father coming out of the office, a look of relief on his face, telling my mother, Baruch Hashem, giving her a hug. With his work done, the boy was handed over to other handlers who were now going to chart his course and plan his future so that he stayed on the straight and narrow. And they left. But the story doesn't end there. About a year and a half later, I'm sitting in Yeshiva Al Tanakh Chabad in Los Angeles, in the Beit Medrash learning. When into the Beit Medrash walked this young man and his brother. I thought he hadn't seen me, so I quickly and quietly made my way to the Vibershul so as to avoid any awkward or embarrassing situations for us. But apparently, he had noticed me, and he made his way to the Vibershul a few moments later. He comes over to me and says, "Do you remember me? Do you know who I am?" now working for a counter missionary organization in Israel, and he was in Los Angeles fundraising. He sat down and we talked about some of the heated subjects. He had talked with my father at the time. I remember sitting with amazement as he told me about that period of his life, how they had offered him a job, a good salary, a car, a house, a wife. All they wanted from him was to translate some stuff into Hebrew and Yiddish, to get some classes, and to absolutely at all costs not change one iota of the way he was dressed. He expressed remorse at the classes he used to give. He said he used to blow shofar at the end of the class and give it more of a Jewish feel. And he was truly sorry, not knowing how many neshamas he may have never affected. Then he turns to me and says, "You know why they were able to copy me? Why they were able to brainwash me? That time, during that year, I was in the hospital for an extended period of time. And then my roommate in the bed next to me was a born-again Christian who introduced me to his pastor. 3 months I was in the hospital. 3 months. And while that pastor visited me every single day, not one of my friends came to visit me. Not one. Do you know the emotional impact that has on someone? Your father pulled me out intellectually. But that emotional scar I still struggle with to this very day. And therein, ladies and gentlemen, lays the all-important lesson. Many of us sitting here today are asking ourselves, what kind of impact can I have on the Jewish world? Rabbi Schochet, a man was an intellectual giant. He was a rabbi, a scholar, an author, a lecturer, a debater. Of course he's going to have an impact on the Jewish world. Me? What can I do? But as the story shows, very often it's the emotional aspects of life that have the most meaning. If you have a Jewish neighbor, smile at him in the morning. Tell him good morning. How are you? Invite him for a Shabbos meal. Sukkot is coming up. Invite him to have a meal in your sukkah. Have a l'chaim, just a mezainis. Needless to say, there's someone that you know, a friend, or even an acquaintance that's sick, whether in the hospital or at home. Take a few minutes out of your day to go visit them. Check in on them. See how they're doing. How are you? They need to help you. Go a little bit out of your comfort zone to make somebody a little more comfortable. The emotional impact that can have on someone's neshama, on someone's pitfall is infinitely greater than all the lectures and debates in the world. You say that through the Achosei Taiva, it's a good resolution that come as a result of tonight, through the Ahavas Yisrael and Ahavas Chinam, that it should be an aliyah for my father's neshama, that we should soon be reunited with my father, we should be reunited with our Rebbe, through the V'yikisu, V'yiranu, Sheikh, Miyakar, the Haim, the Saifa, with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, speedily, Amen.
Portray Rabbi Schochet purely as intellectually debating. I spent quite a few years and times with Rabbi Schochet. The passion, the feelings towards each and every person that came in
they do without wanting the acknowledgement or recognition, nevertheless deserve the expressed appreciation. The list in itself is invariably big, but with no disrespect intended to anyone, I would like to narrow it down in particular to the following at my mother's specific request. Gabi and Rafi Shemel for always being ready to help, and Rafi wheeling our father to and from Shul every single week is really something that was just amazing. The family of Beth Joseph, who have been there for my parents in their time of need, you know who you are. The doctors, the family, and the friends who were there for them through thick and thin, whether driving to hospital, whether attending, whether delivering Shabbos meals, whether visiting regularly. My mother added over here as well, saying last but certainly not least, our children and immediate family, who were always ready with their unbelievable help, their visits, and their support. I'm going to take the liberty beyond that on behalf of my siblings and single out our sister Oria in particular, because her regular flights to the hospital at Dukes of the States, her incessant research and constant liaising with doctors everywhere to the point where they came to know that she was not one to be messed with. I say with absolute conviction that much of the extra time that we were granted with our father was certainly on account of the Rebbeinu Shalom, but in no small measure on account of her as his shlucha as well. And of course, on behalf of myself and my siblings, one doesn't thank a mother or a wife for being there for her husband, but I will say this. It was nothing short of inspirational to witness the care, the sometimes difficult decisions, and in between, from the food to the medicine to the honey to everything else, the attention to detail from the day of diagnosis till the very last day, without exaggeration. Eishes Chayil Aternas Baila, a true woman of worth and valor, is the crown of her husband. We got to watch, to experience, and be inspired by that firsthand. Now, there was much said, and there's so much, of course, that could be said, but in the allocated time, I'd like to restrict myself to the following. The day that our father, Haredi Kaparas Mishkavai, the day that his neshama was returned to Shemayim, was Chav Av. And so I invariably looked at the Shir Chitas of the day, the Chumash, the Tehillim, and the Tanya. The Parsha of that Shabbos was Shabbos Parshas Ekev. Ekev, of course, is the root of the name Yaakov. Vahi Yaakov, we know that Yaakov grabbed hold of the heel of Esau. The pasuk tells us at the beginning of the parsha, "V'haya Ekev Tishbu," and it will be when you will listen to all these ordinances. And then the pasuk continues telling us that V'shamar Hashem Alekecha, the Eibishter himself, will then keep to all the promises and kindness that he swore to our fathers. Reflecting on the unusual term Ekev in the context of the verse where it tells us when, Rashi observes its usual translation and says that it refers to the heel of one's foot, about the so-called little stuff. Those things that man might otherwise tread underfoot, that one might typically disregard. That's where the challenge lies. That's the real demand incumbent upon every single Jew. Shabbos, Kashrus, those are a given. But what about the nitty-gritty? What about the things that seemingly pale in significance? How much attention to detail do we pay to those things? So you'll ask, are they really that important? And the answer is that in actual fact, at least on one level, certainly they are even more important. Because Chazal tell us that we have Ramach Mitzvahs, 248 positive commandments, which corresponds to the Ramach Evarim, the 248 limbs of man. So there are mitzvahs that correspond to man's head, man's heart, etc. And of course there will be mitzvahs that correspond to man's feet, and indeed the very heels of man. And just as Chassidus emphasizes and tells us that it is the piyata, the heels of man, which effectively lift up and elevate his head, so too it is precisely the attention one pays to those mitzvahs that correspond to the heel, which lift up everything else. In other words, if you don't pay sufficient attention to the presumed small stuff, then you run the risk of being pale of malicious. It can unavoidably engender a weakness in what you might believe to be the bigger or more important things as well. You know, there's a simple halacha in Shulchan Aruch that when you're walking with someone more important than you, your father or your teacher, you should always walk to the left of them, put them on the right. It's simple, it's trivia, it's a small detail in halacha. Who really pays attention to that? I can tell you every Shabbos, when walking with my father to and from Shul, if I ended up on the wrong side, he would gently and lovingly pull my ear until I was brought back around to the appropriate side. Not because he was being particular about his covet, but because it's a din in Shulchan Aruch. A small one, but a din nonetheless. All my life, I would hear my father always adding the words, a good yard. If you said good Shabbos, he would say good Shabbos, a good yard. If you said good morning, he would say good morning, a good yard. And amazingly, it was only some months ago when he actually explained it to me. I said to him when I was in the house, good morning. And he said to me, good morning, a good yard. And then he added and explained that Chazal tell us, always be the first to greet someone. So even if someone else got in first with a good morning or a good Shabbos, he would still be able to initiate a different greeting when adding in the words Agad Yar. Small stuff, but it underpins the big stuff. That's insofar as we are to conduct ourselves. But there is a further dimension in regards to this in the way that we may react or the way that we may treat other people as well, which my brother now touched on so beautifully. There may be those whom we might regard as more important, for whom we have more time, for whom we dedicate more energy. And then there are those whom, again, we may tend to dash ba'akava, tread underfoot, people we may see as less important, people for whom we don't necessarily have the same time, for those that we believe may not necessarily be deserving of the same energy and effort, or maybe we even regard as a total waste of time. I was a young and impressionable teenager when those two big burly fellows my brother referred to the Schwartzman brothers were in Toronto. They were involved with my father in a case involving a Jewish boy in a cult. And I remember the time that my father spent with them, the way he would talk with them. As they put it to me one day when they took me out for a donut, the uniqueness of your father is that he can relate to the biggest academic or guys like us and treat us all the same. They were in awe of him, but were also so personally moved, emotionally, psychologically, and above all else, spiritually, because of the time that he gave them and how he related to them. And that stayed with me, always as an ambition to strive for. And perhaps it's best summed up in the words of one Shliach rabbi who called me up in the middle of the Shiva. And he told me the following. He said, my father-in-law, who was an eminent doctor and academic, finally properly understood the whole philosophical concept and notion of free will when my father explained it to him. And then he added, and my kids always remember him as the rabbis who jokingly tried to put on their bathrobe. Minar v'zoken v'kotin kagodo, when everyone was treated at their level with the same sort of time, energy, and passion, and that's certainly something that we can all strive for. But perhaps above all else, there is another intrinsic message in Achan. As I said at the outset, it is the root of the name Yaakov who was so called because Yaakov Avinu took hold of the heel of Esau prior to their birth. His hands grabbed hold of the heel of Esau. And Rashi explains the significance of Yaakov grabbing hold of the heel of Esau, alludes to the idea that this one will barely be able to complete his reign before the other Yaakov will take the kingdom from him. On the microcosmic level, whenever Esau tries to capture a Jewish neshama, the Yodai HaChesed Esau, our father, was there, grabbing hold of the heel of Esau, emotionally and intellectually subduing him and releasing many a Jewish neshama from the clutches of the spiritual enemy. And even so, as one who always learns a lesson from everything,
course, the publication of the book Mashiach. But I will remember many a time when my father would be talking about Mashiach and he would get visibly emotional. Many will have borne witness to the various Haftarah, which obviously speak about Mashiach at the end of days, and he will have become choked up, struggling to continue. It was something that affected him, that touched him, and meant everything to him, heart and soul. I have no doubt that he's continuing to storm Shemayim even now to ensure that he finally merits that Geula Amikus Vashlema. But again, so far as we're concerned, that's something that we need to introspect upon within our own lives, because ultimately everything we do is a means towards that end. That's insofar as the Chumash of the Shabbos Chafah. When one looks at the Shir of Tanya very briefly, it speaks about the different levels of Ava and Yira, the love and the awe, and the reference for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And within that context, that Shir Tanya of that day says that the seal of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is emet, truth, and adds Shehi Midotzai Shel Yaakov. Mavriach Min HaKotzel LaKotzel. That is the midah, the foremost attribute of Yaakov, who molds from one end through to the other. That is from the uppermost of all the levels to the nethermost, causing the truth of the Rebbeinu Shalom to flow to this lowly, dark world. My brother touched on this before, and it's perhaps only something that he and I observed at different intervals. But when our father would say that first pasuk of Shema, he would often literally tremble like a shake or a tremor while reciting the words. Because his ava, his yira, his love, and his awe of the Rebbeinu Shalom was innate. It was as real and as obvious to him as living and breathing. Or as put so beautifully to me last week in Eretz Yisrael, where I was, by one older pasuk. He said to me, by dein Tate, Gettlichkeit is given the Pashtus, was developed as given in his touches. By your father, godliness was a natural, it was given. The existence of this world, that was already something of a novelty. And it was precisely because it was so thoroughly ingrained within him that indeed he never feared to trek into the darker corners of this lowly world in order to spread the truth of Yiddishkeit, the truth of Torah, and the words of Tanya, Shehi Midotzai Shel Yaakov. When we have ingrained within us the real true conviction, then we don't hesitate to pursue, promote, and protect the truth that is Yiddishkeit. And finally, there is the Shir Tehillim of that particular day. There is no reference to Yaakov, there is no reference to Achan. In the Shir Tehillim of Chafov, which we would have read again today in Chavelah. But there is a pleasant pasuk in Kapitel Tov, the 100th Tehillim, which we in fact recite daily in our davening. If to it Hashem B'simcha, always ensure to serve the Eibusher with joy. Our father was a big believer in Gematria, and when you add up the letters of his two names, his two Hebrew names in Makayel, you get 381. The Gematria of Hashem B'simcha is also 381. You know, when our father was initially diagnosed, what do you say when you're 5,000 miles away? Apart from flying in, as we all certainly did, when you could pick up a phone, but what do you actually say? So I did the obvious cowardly thing. I took advantage of modern media and I sent them a one-line email saying, I don't know what to say, other than to repeat what you always tell us, Shach good, Betzayim good, if you think good, it will be good. That was it. This was his reply, interspersed with a lot of Hebrew. I'm going to give you a very brief and loose translation. Thank you. And that's not good, but thank good, as it says, he who trusts in Hashem will be surrounded by divine benevolence, must be the only thought to slogan, and meant emes la'amita with absolute sincerity, with full trust in HaTayva HaMeitiv, he who is good and does only good to all and everything, without allowing even the slightest trace of Atzat HaYetzer, the evil inclination, suggestion to be Chas v'Sholem depressed. And then added, the sign of true trust is continuous joy, which trumps everything, whether we see it or not. And then we have to force ourselves to open our eyes and see it and believe it. And then concluding, Nafsei l'chaim, and Yivdu et Hashem B'simcha, V'such le'lov, serve the Eibusher with joy
signed up with love. Some of you may know the story when my father was a Bocher and he was 770, and one Shabbos the Rebbe came in, and sometimes there was the case that the Rebbe looked as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The Rebbe looked particularly perplexed, and my father sensed the Rebbe's mood, and himself therefore suddenly also found himself somewhat downtrodden. And the Farbrengen was underway, and after the first Sirta, people were saying, L'chaim, and the Rebbe was looking in an altogether different direction. But my father had now already felt as though being dragged down, as it were, by the mood that he sensed by the Rebbe. And all of a sudden, though the Rebbe was looking in completely this direction, he suddenly threw his head the opposite direction, looked directly at my father, called him by his name, and said, Zog l'chaim, v'berk b'simcha, be happy. And then added, if you're not going to be happy, how am I going to be happy? If you will be happy, then I too will be happy. If I can't affect you, how am I going to even be able to affect myself? And my father, he picked up the cup, said, L'chaim. And the Rebbe then looked at him and said, hey, you don't have to do something favors, you don't have to do me any favors. And then the Rebbe looked for our great uncle, my father's uncle, the Chadikov. The Chadikov, Wudo der Chadikov. Du kennst nicht Peil sein, if du Flamenik is also sein der Simcha. He says, where's Chadikov? You can't affect your nephew that he should be the Simcha. Which my father found particularly funny. And then he burst out laughing. And when he did, the Rebbe looked at him and said, look, he's just old to Zog and L'chaim. Now say L'chaim. You know, our father, our parents, drilled into us the fundamental requirement to always be the simple, to always look at the bigger picture. And as he certainly exemplified in the last few years, that for as long as there is always something that you can do about whatever situation, for as long as there's still blood running through your veins, you summon the strength and the resolve and the fortitude and the simcha to live and to fight another day, because one deed is worth more than 1,000 sides. And so, Yaakov Avinu loymeis, Yaakov our forefather said, Chazal never died, Mazarek l'chaim, Mahu l'chaim, just as his children live on, so he lives on as well in his example. The children of the righteous and in their good deeds, the actions by which we remember them and then look to perpetuate in our lives, that's what keeps them alive. So when we walk away from here now tonight, especially in Chodesh Elul, time for haflata, for positive resolution, before the Yom Hadid. We have to strive more for the Eikev on concentrating on the presumed small stuff and the alleged smaller people as we might bigger stuff and the supposed bigger people. And that is achieved when we look to develop our Ahavas Hashem and our Yirach Hashem, our own love and our own awe of the Eibishter in our lives, which in turn will certainly enhance our own bitachon, our own trust in Hasei v'hameitiv, in He who does only good, and with that full trust and that full simcha, we will certainly merit